Hi, I'm Miles Porter. If you're still awake right now, that's perfectly fine. Sometimes the hardest part about falling asleep is trying to fall asleep. So let's not try. Let's just sit here for a while, you and me, and see what happens. Tonight we're on a train. It's a night train leaving from Lisbon, Portugal. The station is called Santa Apollonia. It sits right on the edge of the Tagus River, where the water opens up wide before meeting the Atlantic Ocean. If you were standing on the platform about an hour ago, you would have seen the last of the sunset over the water, deep orange, almost copper. But we missed the sunset. That's all right. We're here now. The cabin is small. There's a reading lamp above the seat, the kind that gives off a warm amber glow. The seats are upholstered in dark blue fabric that smells faintly of wool and coffee. Someone left a newspaper on the fold-down table, but it's in Portuguese, so we'll leave it be. The train shudders, then begins to move, slowly at first. The platform slides past the window. A woman waves to someone in another car. A station clock reads 10:47. And then we're out, into the night. The tracks run east from Lisbon, following the river for a while before turning inland. We'll pass through Spain overnight, through the high, dry plains of Castile, past sleeping towns with names I'll probably mispronounce. Eventually, the train will work its way along the Mediterranean coast, through the south of France, and down through Italy and across to Greece, where, if all goes well, we'll arrive in Athens sometime tomorrow evening. That's a long way off. We have time. I want to tell you a story tonight. It's about a place that may or may not have existed. A place that has fascinated people for over 2,000 years, even though the only person who ever wrote about it might have made it up. The place is called Atlantis. Now, I know, you've heard of Atlantis. Everyone has. It's been in movies and books and cartoons and video games. There was even a song about it. But the real story of Atlantis, the original one, is quieter than all of that, and stranger, and, I think, more interesting. Because here's the thing that surprised me when I first looked into it. The entire legend of Atlantis, every documentary, every expedition, every theory about where it might be, all of it comes from one source, one man. Writing in Athens around 360 years before the Common Era, his name was Plato. And the story he told takes up maybe 20 pages in two of his philosophical dialogues. That's it, 20 pages. And somehow, those 20 pages created one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of the world. The train picks up speed. Outside, the lights of Lisbon's suburbs thin out and give way to darkness. There's a rhythm now. Click-clack, click-clack, like a heartbeat that doesn't belong to anyone. Let's start where the story starts, not with Atlantis, with the man who wrote about it. Plato was born in Athens around 428 or 427 before the Common Era. The exact year is a little uncertain, which is normal for someone born that long ago. His family was wealthy and well-connected. His mother, Perictione, claimed descent from Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker who had lived about 2 centuries earlier. His stepfather had connections to Pericles, the most powerful leader Athens had known. The Peloponnesian War shaped Plato more than almost anything else. It lasted from 431 to 404 before the Common Era, virtually the entire first quarter century of Plato's life. Athens began the war as the dominant power in the Greek world. It had the largest navy, the richest treasury, and the most far-flung network of allied and subject states. By the end of the war, it had lost nearly everything. The turning point came in 413, when Athens launched a disastrous expedition against the city of Syracuse in Sicily. The expedition was the brainchild of the charismatic and reckless Alcibiades, who convinced the Athenians that conquering Syracuse would give them control of the western Mediterranean. Instead, the entire Athenian fleet was destroyed. 40,000 Athenian soldiers and sailors were killed or captured. The survivors were imprisoned in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where most of them died of disease and exposure. Thucydides, the historian, called it the greatest action in Hellenic history, the most glorious to the victors and the most calamitous to the conquered. Plato was about 15 years old when it happened. He would have seen the survivors straggling back to Athens, gaunt and broken. He would have felt the shock that ran through the city. Athens had overreached, had let ambition and greed override caution and wisdom, and had paid the ultimate price. That story should sound familiar. An empire that grows too powerful, too aggressive, too certain of its own superiority, and is destroyed by the consequences of its own ambition. It is the story of Atlantis. Some scholars believe the Syracuse disaster is the hidden template for the Atlantis story. Athens in the Peloponnesian War played both roles. In its early days, Athens was the virtuous city, the defender of Greek freedom against the Persian Empire. By the time of the Syracuse expedition, it had become something more like Atlantis, an imperial power using its navy to dominate and exploit weaker states. The story of Atlantis may be Plato's way of processing this transformation, of asking how a city founded on virtue could become an engine of conquest. The train sways gently. The sound of the wheels is constant and quiet, like a conversation heard through a wall. Outside, the world is dark and soft, and moving past us at a speed that feels, from in here, like the speed of thought. Not fast, not slow, just steady. So Plato grew up in a world of politics and privilege, but he also grew up in a world that was falling apart. Athens was at war. The Peloponnesian War had started a few years before Plato was born. It was a grinding, brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta that lasted 27 years. During Plato's childhood, Athens suffered a terrible plague that killed perhaps a quarter of its population. The historian Thucydides, who caught the plague and survived, wrote that people stopped burying their dead properly. Bodies were left in temples. Some people threw their dead onto other people's funeral pyres. The city's moral fabric, Thucydides said, came undone. Plato saw all of this. He saw the democracy his family belonged to struggle and fail. He saw political factions turn on each other. And then, in 404, when Plato was about 24, Athens lost the war. Sparta imposed a brutal regime called the 30 Tyrants. Two of Plato's own relatives, Critias and Charmides, were part of that regime. They ruled for about 8 months before being overthrown. Both were killed. The democracy came back, but it was shaken and paranoid. And then it did something that changed Plato's life forever. In 399, the restored democracy put Socrates on trial. Socrates was Plato's teacher, a man he admired more than anyone. Socrates was 70 years old. He spent his days in the agora, the marketplace, asking people questions. Not easy questions, hard ones. Questions like, what is justice? And what is courage? And do you actually know what you think you know? He made a lot of people uncomfortable. The charges were corrupting the youth of Athens and failing to honor the city's gods. The trial lasted one day. The jury of 501 citizens voted to convict. Then they voted on the penalty: death. Socrates was given a cup of hemlock, a poison made from a plant in the carrot family. Plato, who was there, later wrote about how Socrates drank it calmly and then lay down and waited. The numbness started in his feet and moved upward. When it reached his chest, he was gone. This broke something in Plato. He had already been skeptical of democracy. Now he was certain that a society governed by the whims of the crowd could not be trusted to make wise decisions. He left Athens for several years. He traveled to Egypt, to Sicily, to southern Italy, where he studied with followers of Pythagoras, the mathematician who believed the universe was built on numbers and harmony. When Plato came back, he founded a school. He called it the Academy, named after the grove of trees where it was located, a grove sacred to the hero Academus. It was, in some ways, the first university in the Western world. Students came to study mathematics, astronomy, music, logic, and above all, philosophy. The Academy would survive for over 900 years, until the Roman Emperor Justinian closed it in 529 of the Common Era. The Academy lasted for a very long time. When you think about how long institutions survive, the Academy is remarkable. It operated continuously for about 916 years, from around 387 before the Common Era until 529, when the Roman Emperor Justinian ordered all the pagan philosophical schools closed. That is longer than any modern university has existed. Harvard, the oldest university in America, was founded in 1636. It has been around for about 390 years. The Academy had already been running for that long when Alexander the Great was born. Plato taught there until his death around 348 before the Common Era. He was about 80 years old. According to one ancient account, he died peacefully at a wedding feast. According to another, he died in his sleep. A fitting end, perhaps, for a man who spent his life arguing that the true reality lies beyond what we can see with our waking eyes. It was at the Academy, late in his life, probably around 360 before the Common Era, that Plato wrote the two dialogues that contain the story of Atlantis. Their names are the Timaeus and the Critias. The train sways gently as we cross a bridge. Below, a river catches the moonlight for a moment, then vanishes. We're moving through the Portuguese countryside now, heading toward the Spanish border. The land here is dry and rolling, covered with cork oaks and olive trees that are invisible in the dark, but whose shapes you can imagine, gnarled and old. Now, Plato didn't just sit down and write a story about a lost island. That wasn't his style. He wrote dialogues, conversations between characters usually featuring Socrates, discussing philosophical problems. The Timaeus and the Critias are the last two parts of what was supposed to be a trilogy. The third part, called the Hermocrates, was either never written or didn't survive. The dialogue opens with four men talking: Socrates, Timaeus, Hermocrates, and a man named Critias. In the conversation, Critias says he knows an old story, a true story, he says, that perfectly illustrates the ideal society Socrates has been describing. He heard it from his grandfather, who was also named Critias, who heard it when he was 10 years old at a festival called the Akrotiri, and that grandfather had heard it from Solon himself. So, the chain goes like this. Egyptian priests tell Solon. Solon tells the elder Critias. The elder Critias tells the younger Critias, and Critias tells Socrates, Timaeus, and Hermocrates. That's at least 4 retellings before Plato writes it down. And Plato himself is the one putting all the words in everyone's mouth, because that's what a dialogue is. There is something beautiful about the way Plato structures the transmission of the Atlantis story. It goes from the very distant past, the Egyptian priests and their ancient records, through a chain of individuals across centuries to the present moment of the dialogue. Each link in the chain is a human being with a name, a time, a place. Solon heard the story in Sais, around 590 before the Common Era. He came home to Athens and told it to Dropides, who was his relative and friend. Dropides told it to his son, the elder Critias. The elder Critias told it to his grandson, the younger Critias, when the boy was 10 years old, at a festival where families gathered to tell stories and share songs. Plato emphasizes this last detail. The younger Critias was 10. He heard the story at a family gathering. He says he remembers it vividly, the way children sometimes remember things from childhood with perfect clarity, while forgetting everything that happened yesterday. This is a human detail. It grounds the story in the ordinary world of family and memory. Whether any of this actually happened, we cannot know, but the structure is deliberate. Plato wants us to believe this is how memory works, imperfectly, through chains of individuals, across time and distance and forgetting, with something true at the bottom of it, even if the details have been worn smooth by retelling. Like a stone in a riverbed. You can see that it was once angular and rough. You know it came from a mountain somewhere upstream, but the river has carried it a long way, and the water has been patient, and now it is smooth and round, and all you can do is hold it in your hand and wonder where it started. This matters, because the question of whether Atlantis is real has haunted people for 2 millennia. And the answer depends partly on whether you think Plato was recording something he genuinely believed to be historical, or whether he was doing what he always did, which was using stories and myths to make philosophical arguments. Aristotle, who was Plato's most famous student, apparently had no doubts. He said Plato invented Atlantis to illustrate a point. The man who created it, Aristotle reportedly said, was the same man who destroyed it. But others weren't so sure, and the story Plato told was detailed enough, specific enough, that it kept people wondering. Let me tell you what the Egyptian priests supposedly told Solon. The window of the cabin has gone dark now. just our own reflections staring back. Sometimes, between the hills, you can see a scatter of stars. The train rocks gently, side to side, like a cradle that runs on diesel and iron. Solon himself is worth knowing about. He was born around 640 before the Common Era and was considered one of the 7 sages of Greece. Before his reforms, Athens was in crisis. The gap between rich and poor had grown so wide that many Athenians had been forced to sell themselves into slavery to pay their debts. The land was concentrated in the hands of a few powerful families. Discontent was rising toward revolution. Solon was appointed as a kind of emergency reformer, given the authority to rewrite the laws. He canceled all outstanding debts. He freed citizens who had been enslaved for debt. He divided the population into classes based on wealth, but gave even the poorest class a voice in the assembly and a role in the courts. He made it illegal for anyone to sell themselves into slavery ever again. His reforms did not please everyone. The rich thought he had gone too far. The poor thought he had not gone far enough. Solon, recognizing that no one was satisfied, and fearing that people would pressure him to change the laws, did something unusual. He left. He made the Athenians swear an oath not to alter his laws for 10 years, and then he traveled abroad. That is how he ended up in Egypt, a lawmaker in voluntary exile, visiting the oldest civilization in the world, listening to stories about the distant past. If the Egyptian priests did tell him about Atlantis, it must have resonated with him. A great civilization that lost its way. A society that had once been just, but became corrupt. The pattern was familiar. He had just spent years trying to save Athens from the same fate. Solon eventually returned to Athens, where he found that his reforms had held, more or less. He spent his last years writing poetry. Some fragments survive. In one, he wrote that he grows old, always learning many things. In another, he described the ideal human life as a progression from childhood through education, love, war, wisdom, and finally old age, each stage lasting 7 years, with death coming after the 10th stage, at age 70. Solon himself lived to be about 80. Solon visited Egypt around 590 to 580 before the Common Era. He was a real person, one of the most respected men in Athens. He had reformed the city's laws, freed citizens who had been enslaved for debt, and generally put Athens on a more stable footing. After finishing his work, he traveled. One of his stops was the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, which had a famous temple dedicated to the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks associated with Athena. At the temple, Solon met the Egyptian priests. Plato describes a conversation in which Solon tried to impress the priests with stories of Greek history, telling them about the great flood of Deucalion, a myth similar to the Noah story. The priests listened politely, and then one of them, an old man, said something that has echoed through the centuries. He said, "Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is no old man among you." What he meant was that the Greeks had no long memory. Every few hundred years, according to the priest, some catastrophe, A flood or a fire or a plague would wipe out Greek civilization, and they would have to start over. They lost their writing. They lost their history. They were always beginning again. But Egypt was different. Egypt kept records. The priests had written chronicles going back thousands of years, carved in stone, preserved in temple archives. And in those chronicles, the priests said, there was a story about Athens itself, from a time so long ago that the Greeks had completely forgotten it. The city of Sais, where Solon had this conversation, was a real place. Its ruins lie in the modern Nile Delta, near the village of Sa el-Hagar. In Solon's time, Sais was the capital of the 26th dynasty of Egypt, also called the Saite dynasty. The pharaoh was probably Amasis II, who ruled from 570 to 526 before the Common Era. Amasis was known for his friendliness toward the Greeks. He allowed Greek merchants to establish a trading colony at Naucratis in the Nile Delta. He donated money to the rebuilding of the temple at Delphi after it burned down. And he welcomed Greek visitors, including, possibly, Solon. The Temple of Neith at Sais was one of the most important in Egypt. Neith was an ancient goddess associated with war, hunting, weaving, and wisdom. The Greeks identified her with Athena, which would have made the connection between Sais and Athens feel meaningful to a visitor like Solon. Whether the priests at Sais actually told Solon about Atlantis, or whether Plato invented the whole conversation, is a question that scholars have debated for centuries. No Egyptian records mentioning Atlantis have ever been found. The archives of Sais, if they existed, have not survived. The city was thoroughly ruined in later centuries, and what remains today is fragments of stone and traces of foundations. But there is a kernel of plausibility here. Egypt did maintain extensive historical records. The priests were keepers of knowledge going back thousands of years, and the Egyptians did have genuine memories of catastrophic events, including volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and the collapse of civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. It is at least conceivable that a garbled memory of the Thera eruption and the decline of Minoan civilization could have survived in Egyptian temple records for the few centuries between the event and Solon's visit. 9,000 years before Solon's visit. That would put it around 9,600 before the Common Era. According to the priest, in those ancient days, Athens had been a just and well-ordered society, governed by wisdom and virtue, and it had faced a terrible enemy. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the Greeks called the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, there existed a great island. It was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. And from that island, you could reach other islands, and from those, you could reach the continent on the far side of the ocean. This island was called Atlantis. It was a mighty empire, rich beyond imagination, with vast armies and a powerful navy. And it had set out to conquer the known world. Atlantis subdued much of North Africa as far as the border of Egypt. It conquered parts of Europe as far as a region called Tyrrhenia, which is roughly modern Tuscany. And then it turned its attention to Athens. What happened next, according to the Egyptian priest, was remarkable. Athens stood alone. Its allies fell away or were conquered. But the Athenians, relying on their courage, their discipline, and their devotion to justice, defeated the Atlantean invasion and freed the peoples who had been enslaved. And then, shortly after this great victory, catastrophe struck. In a single day and a single night, the priest said, terrible earthquakes and floods consumed the land. The army of Athens was swallowed by the earth, and the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea and disappeared. The priest added that this was why the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules was in his time impassable. The sunken remains of the island had created shoals and mud that made navigation impossible. That's the version from the Timaeus, the broad strokes, the outline. But Plato wasn't finished. In the Critias, the companion dialogue, he goes into extraordinary detail about what Atlantis actually looked like. The train has crossed into Spain now, I think. The border out here isn't dramatic. No mountains or rivers to mark it. Just a sign in the darkness, maybe, and a subtle change in the sound of the rails. The conductor passes through the corridor outside, his footsteps soft and unhurried. Everything is quiet. Let me describe Atlantis for you, the way Plato described it, and then we'll both be a little closer to sleep. According to the Critias, the story of Atlantis begins with the gods. In the earliest days, the gods divided the world among themselves. Athena and Hephaestus got Athens. Poseidon, the god of the sea, got the island of Atlantis. On the island, Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Plato. She lived on a hill near the center of the island. Her parents, Evenor and Leucippe, had both died. To protect her and to keep her for himself, Poseidon carved the land around her hill into alternating rings of sea and land. 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land, the hill at the center. No human could reach her because in those days there were no ships. Poseidon and Plato had 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins. The eldest was named Atlas, and he became the first king. From him, the island and the entire ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules took their name, the Atlantic. The second twin was named Gadarus, and he was given the far end of the island, the part closest to the pillars. Plato notes that this area was still called Gadara in his own time. Today we call it Cadiz, a city on the southern coast of Spain. The other 8 sons became rulers of different parts of the island. Each had his own territory, his own people, his own responsibilities. But the line of Atlas held supreme authority, passed from father to eldest son for many generations. Now here is where Plato's description becomes remarkably specific. He gives dimensions, he gives materials, he gives the layout of the city as if he were an architect presenting plans to a client. The central island, where Klito's hill stood, was about 5 stadia across. A stadion was roughly 600 feet, so the central island was about 3,000 feet wide, a little over half a mile. Around it, The rings of water were 1, 2, and 3 stadia wide, separated by rings of land of the same widths. The Atlanteans connected these rings with bridges and tunnels. They carved a canal from the outermost ring of water to the sea, wide enough and deep enough for the largest ships to sail through. Along the rings of land, they built docks and shipyards and warehouses. The city was a harbor within a harbor within a harbor. Ships from all over the world came to trade. The walls of the city were covered in metal. The outer wall was coated in bronze. The middle wall was covered in tin. And the inner wall, the one around the citadel itself, glowed with a reddish light. It was coated in a metal called Orichalcum. Orichalcum. Plato says it was the most precious metal known to the Atlanteans, second only to gold. By his own time, the name existed only in stories. No one knew what it was anymore. The word comes from the Greek orichalkos, meaning mountain copper. For centuries, scholars debated whether it was a real alloy or something Plato invented. Then, in 2015, underwater archaeologists diving off the coast of Gela, a city on the southern shore of Sicily, found something remarkable. They were exploring a shipwreck that had sunk around 600 years before the Common Era. Scattered across the sandy seafloor, they found 39 ingots of an unusual metal. 2 years later, they found 47 more. The metal was analyzed. It turned out to be an alloy of roughly 75 to 80% copper and 14 to 20% zinc, with traces of nickel, lead, and iron. Something like a high-quality brass. The archaeologists called it Orichalcum. Now, this doesn't prove Atlantis existed. The shipwreck was thousands of years too late for that. But it was interesting. It suggested that the word orichalcum, far from being a fantasy, referred to a real alloy that was known and valued in the ancient Mediterranean world. Plato may have borrowed the name and given it a grander history than it actually had. Now, I mentioned that Plato gave dimensions and materials for the city, but I did not tell you everything. And the details are worth knowing, because they are what make the story feel less like a fairy tale and more like something someone actually remembered. The central island, where the temple stood, was connected to the rings of land by bridges wide enough for a trireme to pass underneath. Triremes were the warships of the ancient world, about 120 feet long, powered by 3 banks of oars. So these were not footbridges. They were proper causeways, with gates and towers at each end. Beneath the bridges, the Atlanteans dug tunnels through the rings of land so that ships could sail from the outer harbor all the way to the central island without ever leaving the water. Each ring of water was essentially a separate harbor, and each was busy with commerce. Plato says the docks were crowded with ships from all over the world, and the noise of traders and sailors went on day and night. The outer ring of land, the largest, was given over to a race course for horses. It ran the entire circumference of the ring, which means the track was several miles long. On either side of the race course were barracks for soldiers, housing for guards, and storage for weapons and supplies. The royal palace had been expanded over generations, each king adding to the work of his predecessor. Plato describes it as a complex of interconnected buildings, gardens, pools, and courtyards that eventually reached such a size and splendor that it was hard to know where the palace ended and the temple grounds began. There were also, Plato says, elephants. He mentions them specifically, as though this detail were particularly noteworthy. The island had wild elephants in great numbers, with plenty of food and habitat to sustain them. This is an unusual detail. No other ancient writer places elephants on an Atlantic island. But it is the kind of specific, slightly odd fact that makes you wonder whether Plato was embroidering freely or drawing on some half-remembered report of a real place where elephants lived. Inside the citadel, at the very center of Atlantis, stood the temple of Poseidon and Cleito. Plato describes it as a stadion long and 3 plethra wide, which is about 600 feet by 300 feet. The exterior was covered in silver. The pinnacles were covered in gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory, decorated with gold and silver and orichalcum. The walls and pillars and floors were all orichalcum. In the center of the temple stood a statue of Poseidon. It was so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling. He was depicted standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 sea nymphs riding dolphins. Around the outside of the temple stood golden statues of all 10 original kings and their wives. Near the temple were 2 springs, one of hot water and one of cold. Plato says the hot springs were a gift from Poseidon himself, and the water was remarkably pleasant to bathe in. The Atlanteans built baths and swimming pools, some open to the sky, some roofed over for winter. There were separate baths for the kings, for ordinary citizens, for women, for horses and cattle. Outside the rings of water, the central plain of Atlantis stretched for about 340 miles by 230 miles. It was rectangular, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, and open to the sea on the south. The mountains were celebrated for their number, size, and beauty. Villages and farms dotted the hillsides. Lakes and rivers and meadows supported abundant livestock. The plain itself was crisscrossed by a vast network of canals. The main canal was 100 feet wide, running in a grid pattern across the entire plain, with cross channels connecting them at regular intervals. Farmers used these canals for irrigation and transportation. The system was so efficient that the plain produced 2 harvests a year, one fed by rain and one by the canal water. The train has settled into its rhythm now. We're moving through the flat central highlands of Spain, the Meseta. There's nothing to see out the window, just our reflections, and behind them, the occasional distant light of a farmhouse. Someone in the next compartment turns off their reading lamp. The train gets a little darker. I'm going to tell you about the army of Atlantis now, because Plato describes that in detail too. Each of the 10 districts of the island was required to provide a specific number of soldiers and equipment. Plato gives exact figures. The central plain alone was divided into 60,000 lots, each governed by a leader responsible for providing soldiers. The total forces were enormous: 10,000 chariots, 1,200 ships, various units of archers, slingers, javelin throwers, and heavy infantry. The numbers may sound impossible, but Plato wasn't trying to be modest. He was painting a picture of overwhelming power. What's more interesting is how Atlantis was governed. The 10 kings met periodically at the Temple of Poseidon to discuss laws and settle disputes. Before each meeting, they performed a ritual. They released bulls into the temple grounds. Then they hunted the bulls without weapons, using only ropes and staves. When they caught one, they brought it to the pillar of Orichalcum at the center of the temple, on which the laws of Poseidon were inscribed. They sacrificed the bull over the inscriptions, letting the blood flow across the ancient laws. Then they drank from a golden cup, poured a libation into the fire, and swore to judge according to those laws and never to transgress them. For a long time, this system worked. The people of Atlantis were virtuous. Wealth didn't corrupt them. Power didn't make them arrogant. They cared for their community and honored the gods. But as generations passed, the divine nature in them faded. Plato says the human element overtook the divine. The Atlanteans became greedy. They became aggressive. They began to desire conquest for its own sake. Looking at them, Plato writes, they appeared glorious and blessed, but to any eye discerning true happiness, they were full of avarice and unrighteous power. Plato's ancient Athens is interesting because it is clearly modeled on his own philosophical ideals. In the Republic, which he wrote about 20 years before the Timaeus and Critias, Plato described a just society governed by philosopher kings, with the warrior class dedicated to defense and a producer class devoted to providing food and goods. The ancient Athens of the Atlantis story matches this structure almost exactly. The warriors of ancient Athens, as Plato describes them, lived on the Acropolis. They owned no private property. They ate communal meals. Their children were raised collectively. This Athens was not wealthy. It was not luxurious. It was not powerful in the way that Atlantis was powerful. But it was just. And in Plato's telling, justice is what allows a small city to defeat a vast empire. This is Plato's deepest argument, and it runs through everything he wrote. The strongest society is not the richest or the most militarily powerful. It is the one most devoted to truth, wisdom, and virtue. Everything else, the gold, armies, the temples, is decoration. And Zeus saw this. Zeus, the king of the gods, gathered all the immortals to his palace to decide what to do about Atlantis. The gods assembled. Zeus stood before them, looking down at the earth, and he began to speak. And that is where the Critias ends, mid-sentence. We never hear what Zeus said. We never get Plato's description of the catastrophe. The dialogue simply stops. The unfinished ending of the Critias has puzzled scholars for 2 millennia. Some have argued that the missing ending is lost, that Plato completed the dialogue, but the final pages were damaged or separated from the rest of the manuscript at some point during the centuries of copying. Others believe Plato deliberately chose to stop where he did. There is a literary argument for this. The Critias is about a civilization's downfall. The climax of the story is not the destruction itself, but the moment of judgment, when Zeus looks down and decides that Atlantis has gone too far. By stopping at that moment, Plato creates a silence that is more powerful than any description of falling temples and rising waters could be. It is like a piece of music that stops just before the final chord. the listener's mind supplies the resolution. And in supplying it, the listener becomes part of the story. There is also the matter of the Hermocrates, the third dialogue in the trilogy. We know it was planned because Plato mentions it, but the Hermocrates was either never written or did not survive. Some scholars speculate that it would have described the aftermath of the destruction. Others think it would have drawn philosophical lessons from the stories told by Critias and Timaeus. We will never know. And that absence, that gap in the record, is itself part of the Atlantis legend. The story is incomplete by nature. It invites us to finish it. Nobody knows why. Maybe Plato died before finishing it. He was in his late 70s or early 80s when he was writing it. Maybe he decided the ending was obvious enough that it didn't need to be written. Maybe there was a deliberate artistic choice in the silence, the way a song sometimes ends by simply fading out instead of resolving. Whatever the reason, the story of Atlantis breaks off at the moment of judgment. We know from the Timaeus that the island was destroyed, earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. But the details of that destruction, the ships breaking apart, the temples crumbling, the water rushing in, none of that was ever written. Or if it was, it didn't survive. The train is very quiet now. I can hear the sound of the wheels more clearly, that steady, patient rhythm. Somewhere ahead of us, the track curves, and the train leans gently to one side before straightening again. If you're still listening, that's fine. If you've already drifted off, that's fine too. I'll keep going. Let me tell you more about the war between Athens and Atlantis, because Plato describes it with a level of detail that suggests he thought it was the most important part of the story. Ancient Athens, in Plato's telling, was not the Athens of his own time. It was a different city entirely, a city governed not by the messy, fractious democracy he knew, but by a society organized according to the principles he himself had outlined in the Republic. The warriors were a separate class from the workers. They lived simply on the Acropolis, sharing their meals and their property. They had no gold or silver. Their buildings were modest, but well built. The whole society was oriented toward virtue rather than wealth. This is a clue that Plato was doing something more than telling history. His ancient Athens sounds suspiciously like his ideal state. And Atlantis, with its luxury and aggression, sounds like everything Plato thought was wrong with the real Athens of his own day. But the war itself is described in vivid terms. Atlantis sent ambassadors first, demanding submission. Athens refused. The Atlanteans then mobilized their enormous military. The total fleet numbered 1,200 ships. This was a civilization that could project power across an ocean. Against all of this, Athens had courage, unity, and the advantage of fighting on home ground. The Athenians relied on strategy rather than brute force. They used the mountainous terrain of Attica to their advantage, setting ambushes in narrow passes, attacking supply lines, and avoiding pitched battles where the Atlanteans' superior numbers would count. The war lasted months, not days. Plato describes a campaign of attrition in which the Atlanteans, accustomed to quick victories, found themselves bogged down in a hostile landscape. Their chariots were useless in the mountains. Their heavy infantry struggled in the gorges and narrow valleys. The final battle took place in a valley where the Athenians had prepared an elaborate trap. Using a feigned retreat, they lured the main Atlantean army into a narrow space. Then, from three sides, archers and infantry attacked. The Atlantean formation collapsed. Unable to deploy their chariots or use their numerical advantage, they were cut to pieces. At the same time, the Athenian navy attacked the Atlantean fleet anchored off the coast. The Athenians used light, fast ships to set fire to the heavier Atlantean transports, cutting off any possibility of retreat. The remnants of the Atlantean army fled. Athens did not pursue them. This is a detail Plato seems to emphasize. The Athenians did not seek empire or revenge. They simply defended their freedom and then stopped. And then, shortly after this, both were destroyed. The earthquakes and floods that swallowed Atlantis also consumed the Athenian army. The victors and the vanquished were both swept away, leaving nothing behind but the story itself. The window is dark, except for our reflections. I can see myself in the glass, a dim shape in the warm light of the cabin lamp. Behind me, the seat back. Behind that, the night. I want to talk now about what happened to the story of Atlantis after Plato told it, because for a long time, almost nothing happened. The story nearly vanished. Aristotle, as I mentioned, thought Plato made the whole thing up, and most of the ancient world agreed. The historian Strabo mentioned Atlantis only to dismiss it. Pliny the Elder, who compiled an enormous encyclopedia of the natural world in the 1st century of the Common Era, gave it barely a glance. For the philosophers who followed Plato, the Neoplatonists of late antiquity, Atlantis was interesting only as an allegory, a parable about pride and punishment. When the Roman Empire fell and the medieval period began, interest in Atlantis dropped to nearly zero. The dialogues of Plato were preserved, barely. Monks in European monasteries copied them by hand. But the story of Atlantis was just a few pages in a much larger collection of philosophical works. Nobody thought it was describing a real place. There is something poignant about the way Atlantis survived the Middle Ages. It survived not because anyone cared about it, but because it happened to be attached to texts that people cared about for other reasons. The Timaeus was valued for its cosmology, its description of how the universe was created by a divine craftsman. Medieval monks copied it because they found parallels with the Christian idea of a creator god. The story of Atlantis, tucked into the first few pages, came along for the ride. In the Muslim world, the preservation was more deliberate. Arab scholars of the 8th and 9th centuries undertook a massive project of translating Greek philosophical works into Arabic. The Baghdad Caliph al-Ma'mun, who ruled from 813 to 833, founded the House of Wisdom, a scholarly center that employed translators, astronomers, mathematicians, and physicians. They translated Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and dozens of other Greek and Roman authors. These Arabic translations eventually make their way back to Europe through contact points in Spain, Sicily, and the Crusader states. When European scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries began rediscovering Greek philosophy, they often did so through Arabic intermediaries. A text might have traveled from Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Latin before reaching a European reader. Each translation introduced small changes, small misunderstandings, small additions. Like the Atlantis story itself, the texts arrived worn smooth by the journey. Medieval mapmakers, who were perfectly happy to include imaginary islands on their charts, places like the Islands of the Blessed, or St. Brendan's Isle, or the mythical island of High Brazil, almost never included Atlantis. The idea of a sunken continent beyond the Pillars of Hercules simply didn't capture the medieval imagination. They had their own legends, centered on the Bible, on Noah's flood, on Sodom and Gomorrah. The moral lesson of Atlantis, a proud civilization destroyed by divine wrath, was already present in Scripture, so the pagan version seemed unnecessary. The story survived, though. It survived in the fragile chain of copied manuscripts, in the libraries of Constantinople, in the works of Arab scholars who translated and preserved Greek philosophy during the centuries when Europe had largely forgotten it. And then the world changed. The Renaissance began. Europeans rediscovered the ancient texts. Columbus sailed across the Atlantic. And suddenly, the story of a great civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules didn't seem so unbelievable anymore. We're passing through a town. I can see the dim glow of streetlights through the window, the shuttered front of a small station, a platform empty except for a bench and a trash can. Then we're through, and it's dark again. The first people to seriously connect Atlantis with the real world were the explorers and scholars of the 15th and 16th centuries. When the Portuguese discovered the Azores, a group of volcanic islands in the middle of the Atlantic, some wondered whether these were the mountaintops of Plato's sunken continent. The Canary Islands were another candidate. The Guanche people who lived there before the Spanish arrived had a unique culture, unusual rituals, and legends about ancestors who came from a great land that had been swallowed by the sea. Some scholars suggested the Guanches were descendants of the Atlanteans. The Guanche people of the Canary Islands deserve a little more attention because their story is genuinely mysterious and genuinely sad. When the Spanish arrived in the Canary Islands in the early 15th century, they found a population of people who had been living there in complete isolation for at least 1,000 years. The Guanches had no boats. They had no knowledge of metalworking. They lived in caves and simple stone structures, kept goats, and farmed barley. But they also had things that did not quite fit with their apparent simplicity. They mummified their dead, using techniques that bore a superficial resemblance to Egyptian mummification. They had a complex system of government, with kings and councils. And their legends spoke of ancestors who had come from a great land across the sea. The Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands took nearly a century. The Guanches fought fiercely, but were ultimately overwhelmed by European weapons and diseases. By the end of the 16th century, the Guanche languages were extinct. Their DNA, analyzed in modern studies, links them to Berber populations in North Africa. They most likely arrived on the islands from the nearby African coast. But the idea persists that they were connected to Atlantis, because the Guanches fit the pattern. An isolated people, a lost memory, a connection to a larger story that has been forgotten. These are the raw materials of the Atlantis legend, the gaps in the record that the imagination rushes to fill. But the most dramatic theory came after the discovery of the Americas. Here was an entire continent hidden beyond the ocean with advanced civilizations, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, that built pyramids, practiced astronomy, and developed complex systems of writing and government. To some European thinkers, this looked like proof. Atlantis wasn't beneath the waves, it was America. On maps from the 16th and 17th centuries, you can sometimes find the label Atlantis placed in the ocean, hovering between the Old World and the New, as if the cartographer couldn't quite decide where to put it. Some maps show it as a single island, others as a chain of islands, others as a vast continent stretching from the Bahamas to Brazil. The 15th century also brought fascinating attempts to map Atlantis. Athanasius Kircher, a German Jesuit scholar who lived from 1602 to 1680, was one of the most prolific intellectuals of his age. He wrote over 40 books on subjects ranging from geology to music to hieroglyphics. In his 1665 book, Mundus Subterraneus, Kircher published a map of Atlantis. It showed a large, roughly oval island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, between Africa and the Americas. The map was oriented with south at the top, which is why it looks unfamiliar to modern eyes. Kircher's map is not evidence of Atlantis. It is evidence of how seriously a brilliant man could take Plato's story. The map has been reproduced thousands of times. It appears in almost every book about Atlantis. It gave the legend a cartographic legitimacy that it had never had before, even though the map was entirely speculative. None of these theories had any evidence behind them. But the idea of Atlantis was infectious. It had a hold on the European imagination that mere facts could not shake. The real explosion, though, didn't come until the 19th century, and it came from an unlikely source. The train is climbing now, slowly. We must be approaching the mountains that separate Spain from France. The engine works a little harder. The rhythm of the wheels changes slightly, deepening as the incline steepens. Outside, if we could see, there would be pine forests and rocky slopes, and, higher up, snow. In 1882, a man from Minnesota published a book that changed the Atlantis story forever. His name was Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. He was born in Philadelphia in 1831, the son of an Irish immigrant doctor who died of typhus when Ignatius was a child. His mother ran a pawn shop to support the family. Donnelly became a lawyer, then a politician. He served as lieutenant governor of Minnesota and as a United States congressman. He was a populist, a reformer, a man who believed the powerful were exploiting the poor. He also had a restless, wide-ranging intellect and a gift for writing. His book was called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Before he wrote about Atlantis, Donnelly had a whole other career. He moved to Minnesota as a young man in the 1850s and helped found a utopian community called Ninninger City. It was supposed to be a model town on the banks of the Mississippi River. Land was purchased, streets were planned, a literary magazine was started. Then the financial panic of 1857 hit, and the whole project collapsed. Ninninger City became a ghost town. Donnelly was left with debts and disappointment. He turned to politics. He was elected to Congress as a Republican in 1862 at the age of 31. He served 3 terms. He championed public education, the rights of freed slaves, and the creation of a national weather service. After losing his seat in 1868, he tried repeatedly to return to Congress and failed each time. By the late 1870s, he was broke, frustrated, and looking for a new purpose. He found it in Atlantis. Donnelly spent years in the Library of Congress, reading everything he could find about ancient civilizations, flood myths, geological formations, and oceanic currents. He was a voracious and undiscriminating reader. He accepted good evidence and bad evidence with equal enthusiasm. His book, when it appeared in 1882, was 490 pages long and packed with arguments, some brilliant, some absurd. It was a sensation. It went through dozens of printings. Prime Minister William Gladstone of Britain reportedly considered sending a naval expedition to search for Atlantis after reading it. Donnelly's argument was ambitious. He claimed that Atlantis was not a myth, but a real place, a great island continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that it was the original source of all human civilization. Every ancient culture, from Egypt to Mexico to Greece to India, had gotten its knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, architecture, and writing from Atlantis. The flood myths that appeared in cultures around the world, from Noah to Deucalion to the Aztec legend of the fourth sun, were all memories of the same event, the destruction of Atlantis. Donnelly compared pyramids in Egypt with pyramids in Mexico, and argued they must have a common origin. He pointed to similarities in flood legends across cultures. He noted that plants and animals on both sides of the Atlantic seemed related, suggesting a land bridge that had once connected them. His evidence was impressive in volume, but weak in substance. Later scholars showed that many of his facts were wrong, and even where they were right, his conclusions didn't follow. Pyramids appear in multiple cultures, not because of a shared origin, but because a pyramid is the simplest way to build something tall with stone. Flood myths are common because floods are common. But Donnelly's book didn't just make an argument, it created a feeling. The idea of a lost golden age, a great civilization destroyed by catastrophe, a forgotten chapter of human history waiting to be rediscovered. This was irresistible. It spoke to something deep in people, a longing for a better past, a belief that we had once been wiser and had somehow lost our way. The book also reflected its times. Donnelly was writing during an era of rapid change in America. Industrialization was reshaping cities. Wealth was concentrating in the hands of a few. The old agrarian way of life was disappearing. Atlantis, for Donnelly, wasn't just an ancient mystery, it was a mirror. Most of these arguments have not held up. The pyramid comparison in particular has been thoroughly debunked. Pyramids arise independently in many cultures because they are structurally efficient. You do not need a lost continent to explain why both Egyptians and Maya built them. But Donnelly's book was not popular because it was scientifically rigorous. It was popular because it told a story people wanted to hear. A story about a golden age, a story about a catastrophe, a story about lost knowledge waiting to be recovered. In a world that was changing rapidly, a world of railroads and factories and growing inequality, the idea of a simpler, nobler past had tremendous appeal. Donnelly died on January 1st, 1901, the first day of a new century. He was 69 years old. He left behind a legacy that he could not have imagined. Every Atlantis documentary, every expedition, every theory about crystal energy and ancient astronauts traces a line back to that book written by a failed politician from Minnesota. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, seized on Donnelly's ideas and expanded them into something far grander. In her 1888 book, The Secret Doctrine, she described Atlantis not as an island, but as an entire epoch of human history, an era when a special race, the Atlanteans, possessed supernatural powers and spiritual knowledge. They could communicate telepathically. They used crystals to generate energy. They had flying machines. Blavatsky's version of Atlantis had very little to do with Plato. It was mysticism dressed in the language of ancient history. But it was hugely influential. It spawned dozens of imitators and variations. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Atlantis became a fixture of occult and esoteric literature, a symbol not just of a lost civilization, but of lost knowledge, lost wisdom, lost power. The train has reached the mountains. I can feel it in the way the car tilts and sways. The sound of the wheels echoes differently here, bouncing off rock walls on either side. We're in a pass, or maybe a tunnel. It's hard to tell in the dark. The window shows nothing but our own cabin reflected back at us. If your eyes are heavy, that's good. That's what we're here for. You don't need to remember any of this in the morning. The 20th century brought something new to the Atlantis story. It brought science. Not the pseudoscience of Donnelly or Blavatsky, but actual archaeology, geology, and oceanography. And the first place scientists looked was an island in the Aegean Sea called Santorini. Santorini is one of the most beautiful places in the world. White buildings clinging to the rim of a vast water-filled crater, cruise ships anchored in a lagoon that is actually the flooded caldera of an enormous volcano. Tourists come for the sunsets, which are legendary. But 3,600 years ago, Santorini wasn't beautiful. It was terrifying. The island was called Thera then, and it was home to a thriving Bronze Age settlement called Akrotiri. The people of Akrotiri were connected to the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. They traded with Egypt, Syria, and Cyprus. They built multi-story buildings with advanced plumbing. Their walls were covered in colorful frescoes depicting boxing matches, fishermen carrying their catch, swallows darting through fields of lilies, and elaborate naval processions. Then the volcano erupted. The eruption of Thera, sometime around 1600 before the Common Era, was one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history. Volcanologists rate it as a 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, an 8-point scale. To put that in perspective, the famous eruption of Krakatoa in Indonesia in 1883, which was heard 3,000 miles away and killed 36,000 people, was also rated a 6. Thera was likely more powerful. The eruption of Thera was not a single event. Volcanologists have identified 4 major phases. The first phase deposited a layer of pumice and ash up to 23 feet thick. This initial rain of debris was probably what convinced the last holdouts to evacuate. The second phase was more violent, producing pyroclastic flows, fast-moving clouds of superheated gas and rock that raced down the volcano's flanks at hundreds of miles per hour. The third phase was the climax. The magma chamber collapsed, the caldera formed, and the sea rushed in. This is what created the massive tsunamis that struck Crete and the eastern Mediterranean. The tsunamis hit the northern coast of Crete, 70 miles to the south. At the site of Palikastro, archaeologists found evidence of waves 30 feet high crashing into coastal buildings. On the coast of Turkey, at a site called Çeşme Bagla Rarasi, researchers found the remains of a teenager and a dog, buried in destruction layers from the tsunami. They are believed to be the only confirmed casualties of the Thera eruption ever discovered. Evidence suggests survivors dug through the rubble trying to rescue those trapped. They missed the young man and the dog by about 1 meter. The total volume of material ejected was somewhere between 14 and 30 cubic miles. For comparison, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 ejected about 1/4 of a cubic mile. Irish oak trees, studied through dendrochronology, show stunted growth in the years following, suggesting the ash cloud dimmed sunlight across vast distances for a decade. The eruption ejected roughly 14 to 30 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The island was buried under 200 feet of pumice. The caldera collapsed, and the sea rushed in to fill it. Tsunamis radiated outward, striking the coasts of Crete, Turkey, and North Africa. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean. Tree rings in Ireland and California show stunted growth in the years following, suggesting the eruption's debris cloud affected global temperatures. The settlement at Akrotiri was buried, like a Bronze Age Pompeii, but with one crucial difference. When Pompeii was excavated, archaeologists found casts of people frozen in their final moments, caught by surprise. At Akrotiri, no human remains have ever been found, not one. This suggests that the people had warning. Earthquakes probably preceded the eruption by weeks or months, giving the inhabitants time to evacuate. In 1967, a Greek archaeologist named Spyridon Marinatos began excavating Akrotiri. He hoped to find evidence linking the Thera eruption to the decline of Minoan civilization. What he found instead was a remarkably well-preserved town. Streets, squares, multi-story buildings with intact walls, pottery, furniture, drainage systems, and those stunning frescoes, some of the most beautiful artworks to survive from the ancient world. Marinatos proposed that the Thera eruption was the kernel of truth behind Plato's Atlantis story. An advanced island civilization destroyed by a volcanic catastrophe, its memory preserved in garbled form by Egyptian priests. The concentric rings of Atlantis might correspond to the circular caldera of Santorini. The sudden destruction, the disappearance beneath the waves, the end of an advanced society, it all seemed to fit. The theory was compelling, but had problems. Santorini is in the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The eruption happened about 1,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, not 9,000. And the Minoan civilization on Crete didn't vanish overnight. It continued, in diminished form, for generations after the eruption. The excavations at Akrotiri, which began under Marinatos in 1967 and continue to this day, have revealed only a small fraction of the town. But even that fraction has been astonishing. The buildings are constructed of local stone, reinforced with timber frames to withstand earthquakes. The walls are plastered and painted. Some houses have indoor toilets connected to a sophisticated drainage system that ran beneath the streets. This was 3,600 years ago. Most of Europe would not have plumbing like this for another 3,000 years. The frescoes are extraordinary. One, known as the Flotilla fresco, depicts a naval procession of elaborately decorated ships sailing between two coastal towns. Dolphins leap alongside the vessels. Soldiers and passengers can be seen on deck. The towns have multi-story buildings with tiny figures of people visible in the windows and on rooftops, watching the fleet pass. Another fresco shows two boys boxing. They wear gloves. Their bodies are rendered with careful attention to anatomy and movement. The painting has a lightness and energy that feels surprisingly modern. The spring fresco shows a rocky landscape covered in swallows and lilies. Red lilies bloom from between rocks, their stems bending in an unseen breeze. Swallows dart and circle above. The colors are vivid: red, yellow, blue, and black on a white background. What is notable about the frescoes at Akrotiri is that they were not found only in wealthy homes or public buildings. They were everywhere, in almost every house that has been excavated. This suggests a society that valued beauty broadly, not just as a privilege of the elite. One thing that was not found at Akrotiri was gold. A single gold object was discovered, hidden beneath a floor. Otherwise, the town was gold-free. This, combined with the absence of human remains, tells a story of orderly evacuation. The people of Akrotiri had time to pack their valuables and leave. Where did they go? Some probably went to Crete, which was only about 70 miles south. Others may have gone to the Greek mainland. The Theran refugees, carrying their skills and their memories, may have spread the story of their lost island to cultures throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Still, the Santorini theory remains one of the most widely discussed explanations for the Atlantis legend. It's the one most historians consider most plausible, if you accept that Plato based his story on a real event, but altered the details for his philosophical purposes. The train has come down from the mountains and is moving through a wide valley. Through the window, I can see, faintly, the silhouette of hills against a sky that is just slightly less dark than the land. Stars, when they appear between clouds, are very bright out here, far from any city. Someone has left a half-empty cup of tea on the fold-down table. It rattles gently with the motion of the train, a small, companionable sound. In 1968, another discovery reignited Atlantis fever. Off the coast of Bimini, a small island in the Bahamas, divers found a strange underwater formation. It was a line of large, flat stones arranged in what appeared to be a J-shaped road or wall, stretching for about half a mile across the sandy seafloor. The stones were smooth and regular in shape. Photographs of the Bimini Road, as it came to be called, spread around the world. Edgar Cayce deserves a mention here, because his influence on the Atlantis story in the 20th century was enormous. Cayce was an American psychic who lived from 1877 to 1945. He claimed to be able to enter a trance state in which he could diagnose illnesses, describe past lives, and make prophecies about the future. He gave over 14,000 such readings during his lifetime, and his followers transcribed every one. In many of these readings, Cayce described Atlantis in vivid detail. He said the Atlanteans had developed crystal-powered technology that could generate energy, heal diseases, and transmit communications across long distances. He described flying vehicles and submarines. He said the Atlanteans had ultimately destroyed themselves by misusing their technology, causing volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that sank the island. Cayce also made a specific prediction. He said that a portion of Atlantis would rise from the seafloor near Bimini in 1968 or 1969. When the Bimini Road was discovered in 1968, his followers took it as confirmation. The fact that the formation was natural stone, not a man-made structure, did not diminish their enthusiasm. Cayce's version of Atlantis has very little to do with Plato's, but it has had an outsized influence on popular culture. Many of the ideas that people associate with Atlantis, crystal technology, energy weapons, psychic powers, advanced medicine, come not from Plato, but from Cayce. When people say they believe in Atlantis, they often mean Cayce's Atlantis, not Plato's. The timing was perfect. Just 3 years earlier, the American psychic Edgar Cayce, who had died in 1945, had predicted that evidence of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in 1968 or 1969. Cayce's followers were electrified. Here it was, the road to Atlantis. Geologists were less impressed. Closer examination revealed that the Bimini Road was almost certainly a natural formation. It was made of beach rock, a type of limestone that forms in shallow tropical waters and naturally cracks into regular rectangular shapes. Similar formations exist throughout the Caribbean. The stones weren't placed by human hands. They were deposited by the sea. But for many Atlantis enthusiasts, Bimini remained powerful symbolic evidence. The desire to believe was stronger than the facts. Around the same time, a more exotic theory was taking shape. In his 1958 book, Earth's Shifting Crust, Charles Hapgood proposed that the entire outer shell of the Earth could sometimes slip over the inner layers, like a loose peel on an orange. This meant that continents could rapidly change their positions relative to the poles. Antarctica, Hapgood suggested, had once been located in warmer latitudes, free of ice, and could have supported an advanced civilization. The Antarctica theory has a peculiar history. Hapgood, who proposed the Earth's crust displacement idea, was not a geologist. He was a professor of history at a small college in New Hampshire. His theory was born partly from studying old maps, particularly the Piri-Reis map, a 1513 Ottoman map that appears to show the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy, even though the continent wasn't officially discovered until 1820. Hapgood argued that the Piri-Reis map was based on much older source maps, possibly dating back to a pre-ice civilization that had mapped Antarctica when it was still free of glaciers. The map does show a landmass at the southern edge that could, with some imagination, be interpreted as the Antarctic coast. But cartographic historians have pointed out that many old maps include speculative southern lands, a tradition going back to Ptolemy's assumption that a massive southern continent must exist to balance the northern land masses. The idea that Antarctica could be Atlantis was given a second life by the writer Graham Hancock in his 1995 bestseller, Fingerprints of the Gods. Hancock, a former journalist for The Economist, argued that an advanced civilization had existed during the last ice age and been destroyed by a cataclysmic event around 10,800 before the Common Era, corresponding to the Younger Dryas period. He drew on Hapgood's work, Donnelly's arguments, and a wide range of archaeological and geological evidence that, he argued, mainstream science had ignored or misinterpreted. Hancock's book sold millions of copies and introduced the Atlantis legend to a new generation. It also drew fierce criticism from archaeologists and geologists who pointed out numerous errors and misleading claims. But the debate itself was useful because it forced mainstream scholars to explain why the idea of a lost, advanced civilization was implausible, and in doing so, to communicate the actual evidence about human prehistory to a broader audience. Albert Einstein, in a curious footnote, wrote a foreword to Hapgood's book, praising its ingenuity while remaining cautious about its conclusions. The idea that Atlantis might be Antarctica, buried under miles of ice, was picked up by other writers and became a staple of alternative history. Modern geology, however, leaves no room for it. Ice core data shows that Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years. The continent's position near the South Pole is not the result of a sudden shift. It is the result of slow, steady plate tectonic movement over tens of millions of years. And that brings us to the most fundamental problem with the idea of a sunken Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. It doesn't exist. By the late 20th century, scientists had mapped the ocean floor in extraordinary detail using sonar, satellite data, and deep-sea submersibles. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a massive underwater mountain range running down the center of the Atlantic, was found to be a tectonic boundary where new seafloor is being created, not a place where a continent sank. There is no geological evidence, none at all, for a large landmass that suddenly disappeared in the Atlantic Ocean within the last 12,000 years. Plate tectonics explains how continents move. They don't sink. They slide very slowly, pushed by the spreading of the ocean floor. A continent cannot disappear in a day and a night. That process takes millions of years. The science of plate tectonics, which developed in the 1960s, essentially settled the question of whether a large landmass could have sunk in the Atlantic Ocean within recorded human history. The answer is no. Continental crust and oceanic crust are fundamentally different materials. Continental crust is thick and relatively light. Oceanic crust is thin and dense. Continents float on the mantle like blocks of wood on water. They do not sink. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the underwater mountain range that runs from Iceland to the Antarctic, is not the spine of a sunken continent. It is a divergent plate, boundary, a place where two tectonic plates are pulling apart and new oceanic crust is being created by magma rising from below. The process is slow, about 1 inch per year, the speed at which a fingernail grows. If Atlantis had existed as a continental landmass in the Atlantic, there would be evidence. Crustal thickness measurements, sediment cores from the ocean floor, gravity anomalies detectable by satellite. All of these would show something. They show nothing. The Atlantic Ocean floor is exactly what plate tectonics predicts it should be. Young oceanic crust growing outward from the ridge with no traces of a submerged continent. Plato's description of a landmass larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, sitting in the Atlantic beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, is physically impossible given what we know about how the Earth works. Something that large could not have sunk in the 11,600 years since the date Plato gives. The geology simply does not allow it. This is not a popular conclusion. People do not like being told that the thing they are looking for cannot exist. But it is what the evidence shows. Which brings us to the question of where all this leaves Atlantis. The train is moving through the south of France now, or at least that's where I think we are. The air coming through a small vent at the top of the window has changed. It's cooler and carries a faint scent of pine and stone. The Mediterranean isn't far away. We'll be following its coast soon, through Marseille and Nice and Genoa, and down the Italian boot. I want to return to the question of why Atlantis matters. Not whether it is real. That question misses the point. The question is why the story has survived for 2,400 years when so many other stories from the ancient world have been forgotten. Part of the answer is simple. It is a good story. A powerful civilization brought low by its own arrogance. A world swallowed by the sea. There is something primal about it. It taps into the same fears that flood myths tap into. The fear that everything we have built can be washed away. But there is something more specific about Atlantis. It is the idea that somewhere, sometime, human beings got it right. They built a just society. They lived in harmony with the gods and with nature. And then they lost it. Not because of bad luck or natural disaster, but because of their own moral failure. This is a very different kind of story from most myths of the Golden Age. In the Greek myth of the ages of man, the Golden Age just ends. The gods replace the golden race with a silver one, then a bronze one, then iron. It is a decline without a clear moral. In the Garden of Eden, the fall is caused by disobedience to a specific command. But in Atlantis, the fall is gradual. It is not one act of defiance. It is a slow erosion of values. Generation by generation, the Atlanteans became a little more greedy, a little more proud, a little less concerned with justice. No single generation was responsible. The decline was so gradual that the people living through it probably did not even notice. That is what makes the story feel modern. We know what gradual decline looks like. We see it in institutions that were once admirable and become corrupt over time. We see it in cultures that trade wisdom for entertainment, depth for distraction, substance for spectacle. The Atlantis story is a warning not about a single catastrophic mistake, but about the slow, quiet abandonment of the things that make a civilization worth preserving. Plato knew this. He lived through a version of it. He watched Athens go from the city of Pericles and Sophocles to the city that executed Socrates. He spent his whole life trying to understand how societies fail and how they might be saved. Atlantis was his most vivid illustration of the problem. The train has slowed. We might be approaching a station or yielding to another train on the line. The silence that fills the gap when the engine eases is remarkable. For a few seconds, you can hear things you could not hear before. The creak of the car's suspension, a bird somewhere outside singing its first notes of the morning, the faint, distant sound of water. Then the engine picks up again, and we are moving, and the rhythm returns. There is a more recent theory about Atlantis that I want to tell you about. Not because it's true, necessarily, but because it's interesting, and because it shows how the legend keeps finding new life. In the western Sahara Desert, in the country of Mauritania, there is a geological formation called the Richat Structure. Seen from the air, it looks like a giant eye staring up from the sand. A bullseye of concentric ridges and valleys about 25 miles across, sitting on the Edgar Plateau. NASA astronauts on the early Gemini missions used it as a landmark when orbiting the Earth. They couldn't miss it. It's one of the most distinctive features on the planet when viewed from above. For most of the 20th century, geologists debated what had created it. An asteroid impact was one early theory. Eventually, they determined that it was a geological dome, formed by an upwelling of igneous rock about 100 million years ago, then sculpted by wind and water erosion into its current shape. In 2018, a YouTube video proposed that the Richat Structure was the remains of Atlantis. The video went viral, millions of views. The Richat Structure was first described in the 1930s and 1940s by French geologists working in West Africa. It was originally called the Richat Crater because everyone assumed something that circular must have been made by an impact. But there was no shocked quartz, no iridium anomaly, none of the telltale signatures of a meteorite strike. By the 1960s, the impact theory was abandoned. Gemini astronauts photographed it from orbit in the mid-1960s. From space, it is one of the most recognizable features on the African continent. The concentric ridges, made of resistant quartzite, stand out clearly against the surrounding sandstone. The structure is not a perfect circle. It is slightly elliptical, about 25 miles at its widest. But from 200 miles up, the resemblance to a giant eye is unmistakable. The YouTube video that proposed the Atlantis connection was published by a channel called Bright Insight. It received over 3.8 million views. The argument was covered by newspapers and magazines around the world, from Germany's Der Spiegel to the UK tabloids. It touched a nerve. People wanted it to be true. The strongest argument against the theory is simple. There is no archaeological evidence. None. No pottery shards, no foundations, no metal tools, no refuse pits, no burial grounds. If a great civilization had existed at the Richat Structure, it would have left something behind. Cities always do. Even cities destroyed by floods and buried by sand leave traces. The absence of any trace is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is evidence that no city was ever there. The argument was based on several apparent correspondences. The concentric rings of the Richat Structure resemble Plato's description of Atlantis. The outer diameter, about 23.5 kilometers, is close to the 127 stadia that Plato gives for the city. There are mountains to the north, as Plato described. There is an opening to the southwest that could have been a canal to the sea. Proponents also point out that the Sahara was once green. Pollen records and satellite data show that, as recently as 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, the Sahara was covered in lakes, rivers, grasslands, and forests. Hippos and crocodiles lived there. Humans fished and farmed. The ancient Tamanrasset River once flowed from the Atlas Mountains south toward the Richat Structure before turning west to the Atlantic. It's a fascinating idea, but there's a significant problem. Actually, several. The Richat Structure is about 1,200 feet above sea level. There is no evidence it was ever at sea level during the time period in question. There are no archaeological remains of a city, no pottery, no foundations, no metal tools, nothing that would indicate a large civilization ever existed there. The geological structure is 100 million years old. It was not built by anyone. The theory is a good example of how Atlantis works as a cultural phenomenon. People see patterns. They find correspondences. The concentric rings of the Richat Structure really do look like Plato's description. But looking like something is not the same as being something. A natural formation that resembles a city is still a natural formation. And yet, the theory won't go away, because Atlantis never goes away. We're along the coast now. I can feel it in the way the air tastes, salty and humid, slipping through the tiny gap where the window doesn't quite seal. The train curves around a headland, and for a moment I think I can see moonlight on water, but it might just be a field. At night, everything silver could be the sea. I want to tell you something that I find comforting about the Atlantis story, and it's this. Plato didn't write about Atlantis because he wanted people to go looking for it. He wrote about it because he wanted people to think about themselves. The story of Atlantis, at its heart, is a story about what happens when a society loses its way. The Atlanteans started out virtuous. They were wise and just. They honored the gods and cared for one another. Their wealth and power were expressions of their inner goodness. But as time passed, the divine element in them weakened. Plato describes it in a way that feels very modern. They stopped caring about the things that mattered. They became obsessed with wealth and military power. They looked impressive on the outside, but were hollow on the inside. They wanted more, and they forgot why they had built their civilization in the first place. And so the gods destroyed them. Not because they were jealous of human achievement, but because the achievement had become detached from the values that made it meaningful. Plato was writing this in the late 360s before the Common Era. Athens was still recovering from the Peloponnesian War. The great golden age of Pericles was a fading memory. The democracy that had executed Socrates was still in power. Plato was an old man watching his city struggle with the same problems Atlantis had faced. How to remain just and wise in a world that rewards power and wealth. The train is quieter now. The rhythm of the wheels has slowed. Or maybe I'm just more aware of the pauses between beats. The reading lamp above my seat flickers once, then steadies. I want to leave you with one more thing, and then I'll let the train do the rest. Atlantis has been searched for in the Azores, in Santorini, in the Bahamas, in Antarctica, in Spain, in Morocco, in the Black Sea, in the Sahara Desert, in Ireland, in Indonesia, and in dozens of other places. Hundreds of books have been written about it. Millions of hours of television have been devoted to it. Whole careers have been built on finding it. Close your eyes. The train will take us the rest of the way. If you're still here, if you've been listening all this while, thank you. That means something. And if this journey helped you rest tonight, maybe you'd like to ride with us again sometime. Good night.